a difficult language, and are we the bad guys as far as, like, we like to talk about how other languages are really hard to learn, but are we actually the hardest when it comes to learning? So, a little bit about English to begin with. It's a Germanic language of the Indo-European family. So the Indo-European family is basically one of the 6 major language families. So you've got Sino-Tibetan, which is like the Asian families, Afro-Asiatic, there's a few others as well. And the Germanic branch of this family is the one that English is in, and it's also in it with German, Dutch, a few other languages. You've probably heard of the Romance languages, or maybe even Slavic languages. They're all part of this Indo-European family. So it is also the most spoken language, with almost 1.5 billion speakers, and it's about 1400 years old, originating obviously in England. I believe it was I can't remember the name of the group. It was Anglo-Saxons, obviously. And it's considered to be a hard language because of its many rules and exceptions to rules, as we'll talk about later. And English speakers also, according to people learning the language, know nothing about their own language, which I have heard personally when people learning English ask English speakers questions about, why do we do it this way? And generally we don't know why. Their answer is just it feels right. So getting into how hard English actually is, it's generally considered to be a difficult language for learners. It's not the hardest language, in my opinion, but it does have a lot of things that can make it hard for learners, and harder than easier languages like Spanish, for example. So vocab, it is one of the most vocab-rich languages. It has a lot of words. It doesn't have the most words. I believe that does go to Korean. But English is up there. The amount of words it has is disputed, somewhere between 170,000 to potentially 800,000 or 700,000 words. So it does have a lot. Obviously you don't need them all. I think it's estimated the average person only knows about 40,000. So, like, if we're looking at the maximum there, that's less than 10% of the whole language you actually know. But yeah, so it does have a lot of words needed to be learnt. Orthographic depth, basically what orthographic depth is how easy it is to pronounce words based on reading them. So if you take a language like Japanese, for example, where it's just, you can basically read everything that's written down, unless it's in kanji, you can read everything that's written down, and as long as you know the alphabet, you can pronounce it perfectly. Whereas with English, as we know, pronunciation can be very difficult and different depending on the word. So you've got a word like laugh, where GH is pronounced th, but then you've got a word like although, where you don't pronounce like the F sound at the end, you just you ignore the GH, and that can be really difficult for people learning the language in the first place. So orthographic depth is generally, when you say a language has deep orthographic depth, it means it is hard to pronounce based on reading it. So that's also languages like Russian, Mandarin, and French is definitely a good example. And then shallower languages are ones that are easy to read. So I think Dutch and German are considered easy, and there's obviously more as well. And languages in the middle too. As far as grammar goes, English doesn't have the most difficult grammar, but it does have like interesting grammar rules with conjugations and that kind of thing. Rules for grammar ties heavily into exceptions that I've got below as well. English is the language of exceptions because of how much we break our own rules. Like, everyone's obviously heard of the old I before E except after C, and then it's broken in science, it's broken in the word ancient. There's probably a whole list you can find online of words that breaks that rule, and so it's not even really a rule. But yeah, we break all of our own rules a lot, and there's plenty of examples of that. If you look at like how verbs are changed as well, there's just different ways to do it. Like, you can't just put ed on the end of something. So like walk obviously goes to walked when you're talking about it in the past, but you can't just put ed on everything because there's verbs that don't operate like that. And then of course you got slang. Obviously any non-literal talk, like, just, you'd be surprised how much of conversation is just non-literal, like saying something's still up in the air, and just things that don't make literal sense. When you come from another language, if you only speak one language, you wouldn't realize that they use just different expressions and stuff that just doesn't make sense. So that can be very difficult for learners coming if they want to communicate effectively. So overall, it's English. That might sound like a lot of hard things. It's definitely not the hardest language overall, and this is all from an objective standpoint as well. Obviously, if you speak a language similar to English, it's going to be easier to learn it than, for example, Mandarin. And if you already speak Cantonese, for example, it might be easier to learn Mandarin than it is English. So it's very relative to where you're coming from. But from an objective standpoint, just looking at what is difficult about the language, there's definitely languages that are harder than English. Like, for example, a lot of Slavic and Middle Eastern languages have very, very complicated grammar, and that's not even going into African languages and like languages that are spoken by smaller communities that aren't examined. As far as alphabets go, Mandarin it's either a logographic or pictographic alphabet, because basically they use tens of thousands of characters to write, which can be really hard for people used to just 26. And Arabic, I believe, has also 26 letters in the alphabet, but they each have 4 forms depending on where they are, and it's entirely cursive, which can be difficult. And also when you consider it's written right to left, which can be difficult if you're writing in pen, for example, and most people are right-handed, you're going to rub out your own writing, which kind of sucks for left-handed people in English, but that's just the way it is. Orthography, Mandarin and French have really hard orthography as well, because of the pictographic nature of Mandarin, and French having just interesting pronunciation. I think everyone knows that. But yeah, English is still definitely a challenging language, and objectively, if you want to go off as far as like the amount of people who know it, English is still the most spoken language. So you could say objectively it's the best one to start off with, because you get to start with the most resources for learning other languages. So yeah, be grateful for that, even though it can be annoying sometimes. And yeah, that should be all. But thank you for listening, guys, and please subscribe and like the video.